It's really interesting. Terence Crawford finds himself in a bit of a tricky situation. He's a unified, undisputed light welterweight champion. He has all the belts, the ring belt, the lineal belt. He has every title that one could really hope for, or want for. As a boxer, he kind of achieved the dream. Basically, he's living the dream right now. He managed to collect every belt that there is. But with that, comes certain consequences of that. In making this fight with Julius Ndongo actually risked even getting stripped by the IBF because he had Sergey Lipinets there as looming mandatory for that IBF belt. And IBF, unlike the other three organizations, they actually, really push forward their unifications in a much more just a consistent manner, really. Like, as soon as they make somebody a mandatory, they're going to push for that guy to get his mandated shot. Which is incidentally how Errol Spence managed to get his shot at Kell Brook, for instance. Otherwise, Spence probably still wouldn't be a champion had the IBF not forced the hand of Brook and Hearn and etc. But yeah, Crawford finds himself in a bit of a tricky situation because 140 pounds, not unlike 135 pounds when Crawford was there, is a division that's kind of waned the last couple of years. Every division goes through it. There's periods of waxing and waning, like the way that the sun and the moon rise and fall every day. We just had the solar eclipse, so I think that's a pretty good allegory for it. Um, you know, uh, every couple of years, there's going to be a hot division, and then usually a year or two after that, that division isn't as hot, and it'll be either the next division up or the next division down that's more of a hot division. I think a good case in point would be, say, like right now, the super flyweight division. It's a hot division, the hottest division in boxing. Tons of talent, tons of guys that are proven prime time, in the prime of their career, champions and former champions. Whereas 2-3 years ago, it was the flyweight division. That had Chocolatito and Estrada and Kazutoyoka, and Danietes was kind of inching towards flyweight. Only barely made his debut more recently. And I'm not wrong, and Zhou Shiming, and McWilliams Arroyo is still out there and everything, and Brian Valoya at the time, and Tyson Marquez when he was still a viable competitor. And now it's super flyweight with Inoue and Chocolatito, Estrada, Cuadras, Sri Saket, Khalil Yafai, Jervin Akaz, Rashid Warren, and then just a number of high-level fighters at the weight class. That tends to happen. Guys will move up in weight oftentimes and or move down in weight. And then you'll also have like a new crop of contenders and or champions that emerge at a given weight class, that prove their worth and that make a division, hot, and that make it so that we're going to get really compelling, exciting matchups. Unfortunately for Crawford, his ascendance kind of came at a time where lightweight was waning, and then where light welterweight was waning. Because like a couple of years ago, light welterweight was a pretty hot division. Of course, I think kind of culminating with the Matisse versus Danny Garcia fight. Danny Garcia eventually moved up. Broner couldn't make 140. He's always been kind of here and there as to making 140 or 147. You had Lamont Peterson there, Matisse himself, and so on and so forth. Zab Judah even. But last couple of years, just as kind of Crawford moved up into the division, moved out of lightweight, lightweight all of a sudden this year has become a little bit of a hotter division. With the inclusion of Mikey Garcia, Jorge Linares, the emergence of Robert Easter, Denis Shavakov out there plugging away. Just guys like that. Whereas like welterweight, a lot of the bigger stars wound up moving up to welterweight. And even Manny Pacquiao, it doesn't seem like he's ever going to drop down to 140 ever again, even though that definitely seemed like a possibility a couple of years ago, for instance, or the last couple of years up until more recently where Jeff Horn relieved him of his title, I'll say. But Crawford finds himself in a tricky situation because, he has the IBF mandatory looming, Sergey Lipinets. Lipinets really, he's a good fighter, but he's just not on Crawford's level. Crawford has beaten guys that really were better than Lipinets, frankly. And It's just one of those things where compelling matchups at 140 pounds are a bit hard to come by for Terence Crawford. Even amongst the guys that are his looming mandatories or number one contenders or however you want to put it. I know the WBO mandatory is Antonio Orozco. Orozco is a pretty good fighter as well, but he's a guy that I think that Crawford kind of outboxes reasonably soundly. Although I think Orozco is probably a better fighter than Lipinets. For the WBA, you have a kind of an even trickier situation because of the fact that Francis Barthelemy and Kiro Relic are actually mandated to rematch each other. I do think the winner of that fight would be a pretty compelling matchup for Crawford. Barthelemy is a guy kind of similar to Crawford, who, he was very big at 130 pounds, his initial weight class, was able to kind of boss everybody around there. And he has some kind of pound-for-pound chops of his own, really. Barthelemy does. He won a title at 130, at 135. Managed to get over on Relic at 140, even though it's kind of dicey as to whether he deserved that decision or not, or at the very least whether he deserved it by the margins that he got it, which is a big part of why they're actually rematching. And Relic is another guy. He's a pretty good fighter. He's a guy that's kind of proven to be really tough, really difficult, and I think would at least provide a reasonable challenge for Crawford in light of what's generally a bit of a division, like I said, that's waning for the most part. WBC is where it gets even trickier because of the fact that number one contender right now is Amir Imam. And Amir Imam, for Crawford and for Top Rank, is a very high-risk, low-reward opponent because people have already seen Imam stopped. People have already seen Imam exposed. So if Crawford beats Imam, as he should, then it's like he doesn't really get any great push from that, critically speaking. And if he loses to Imam, not only does he drop in the critical standings of pound for pound or his rating at 140 or what have you, but he also drops in terms of money making opportunities, financially speaking. So that complicates matters even more. Although the number two contender, Regis Prograis, is actually a very, very good contender. He's a very good fighter. But again, somewhat similar to Imam, he's a high risk, low reward opponent. Because Prograis he's not a top ranked fighter, for instance, and he's a devastating power puncher, with very quick hands, good height and reach on him as well, and he's just a problem, man. He's a damn good fighter. He's the definition of kind of a dark horse contender, a guy that really hasn't gotten the major push on the PBC or the Top Rank or the Golden Boy side of things. He hasn't gotten that hype train kind of chugging along for him, but he's a damn good fighter. He's kind of one of those underground hype fighters that you basically say look out for this guy, because he could potentially take out your A side on any given night. You may not know too much about him. He may have his biggest fight may have been on a Showbox Friday night card, but this is absolutely the type of guy that's ready for prime time. As far as I'm concerned, I definitely think that he is. Maybe not necessarily for Crawford's level, because I do think that Crawford is a bit of a transcendent talent in that fashion. But a guy that's extremely dangerous, and a guy that I'd probably pick against any but of the other names that I just mentioned. I'd pick Prograis over Imam, Barthelemy, Relic, Lipinets, and Orozco. But yeah, Crawford's in a bit of a tricky situation. All these sanctioning fees, I'm sure, probably aren't helping matters either. So I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if Crawford decided to drop the belts if the money meant more to him. But I'm not necessarily sure that it does. I mean, he is getting paid fairly well. So maybe he's feeling like paying the cost to be the boss is a good thing. I mean, the way that I would personally go about it is, I would just let the sanctioning bodies strip me or whatever. Because the way that I see it, there's really not much of a point in having more than one belt at one time if people already consider the Lineal and or Ring Magazine champion, because that's truly like the best prize in any given weight class. That really is, being considered the man, the best, the champ, the true champ, the true champ in the lineal sense of the things, in the old school sense of things, back when there was one belt. So I wouldn't even mind that, if Crawford just let the IPF strip him. Because then at that point, if you wanted to run back and go and get that belt, he could say that, well, he just beat a champion or titleist at the very least in Lipinets after he dropped the belt or whatever. Go back and get the belt back, basically. it's one of those things where I really wouldn't mind seeing him just drop the belts, let those other guys pick them up, and then you can go about recollecting those belts by picking off each champion, as they stand, taking their zeros and doing it for much less cost, because at that point you're not paying more than one sanctioning fee at any one given time. But I mean, that's just kind of my thoughts about it generally speaking. Yeah, it's nice to be able to say like, oh, I have all the belts and everything. But at the same time, I mean, considering the quickness with which a lot of these sanctioning bodies tend to strip people anyway, it's at the end of the day, they're not taking the belts from you. A lot of people don't even know that the fact that the belt that you see isn't this like the belt that you see when a champion defeats or when a contender beats a champion isn't the belt that they get. The champion keeps their belt, and then eventually the WBC, the WBA, the IBF, the WBO ring, etc. Either mails or presents live to the new champion their own belt that they keep forever. That's why you'll sometimes see guys that don't necessarily hold a given belt at the current present time still having their posse, their crew, as they walk to the ring, carrying those belts with them, and posing with those belts and stuff. Because at the end of the day, those belts are basically achievements, or they're awards essentially. They're like a trophy. They're like a trophy that of something that like you've of accomplishment, not necessarily just something to be defended. Although defending is certainly something that I wouldn't necessarily take lightly. But that's just kind of the way I see it. It's weighing out both the financial impact that the sanctioning bodies can have on you, as well as the significance of defending your titles. To me, it doesn't really make much sense than to have the Ring Magazine belt, effectively the Lineal title, and any one of the four. Pick and choose. Just roll the dice, flip a coin, blindfold yourself and throw a dart. Choose any one of the four sanctioning bodies along with basically the Lineal title, and you're pretty much golden as far as I'm concerned. That's pretty much all that really matters. And then if you come across another belt holder that has several of the belts, then hey, you should fight him. That was the situation that Roman Gonzalez had with Juan Estrada. Gonzalez had the WBC and the ring belt, the Lineal title, and Estrada had the WBA and the WBO, or the WBA Super, quote unquote, and the WBO. And they really should have fought at flyweight, but certain things got in the way of that, HBO money, etc. Unfortunately, you don't see that too much at the lighter weights, but it did kind of get in the way in that regard. But hopefully that'll be solved fairly soon. But I'm getting a little bit off track with regard to it. Crawford is kind of in between a rock and a hard place. At the end of the day, I think most people really want to see him fight Mikey Garcia, but that's a fight that, for promotional issues is somewhat difficult to make. So even if that doesn't necessarily happen, any of the other fights that I mentioned, against the top contenders would be reasonable and I think acceptable at the very least. Not necessarily optimal, but acceptable. I think optimally speaking, at least from me, somebody that's a bit of a, expert, a pundit, somebody that really follows boxing closely, I'd like to see him fight Prograis. I think that guy's a serious problem. Or maybe, at the very least, start collecting zeros against some of these guys. Whether he decides to keep all the belts or drop them, one by one, or however he decides to do it. But, to me, Garcia is really the most viable contender for Crawford. After him would probably be pretty much a toss-up between Barthélemy, Relic, and Prograis. After them would probably be Orozco, and then after him would be I'd probably put Lipinets and Imam really on about the same level in terms of that, the significance of the win. I think Imam is actually still a very good high-level light welterweight. As long as he's able to make the weight anyway. I know he kind of yo-yos a little bit. He's definitely got a cut to make that, but he's still a pretty damn good fighter. And of course, funny enough, you have Maurice Hooker rated at number 2 by the WBO, which is pretty funny. Crawford destroys that guy, man. He destroy Hooker. I think probably does it in fairly similar fashion to what he did to Ndonga, but that's probably another video for another day. Crawford's a very good fighter. He just kind of finds himself in a difficult position, and it doesn't seem like he's quite ready to move up to welterweight just yet. So let's see what he does. But that's it for this one. I'll catch you guys on the next. Peace.